After a successful decade run as a featured documentary, Eyes of the Mothman is now a podcast containing bonus information and, for the first time ever, the complete, unedited field interview tapes with eyewitnesses, experts, and those who were directly impacted by the Mothman incidents that occurred in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in 1966 and 1967. Although this podcast is meant to act as a historical record and an archive of the events that transpired, all material contained here is not for reproduction without the written consent by the copyright holder, Redline Studios Incorporated. Episode 20 of Eyes of the Mothman, the podcast, is revisiting a very brief interview we did with Lea Wilson, but it was an interesting one. Do you guys remember Lea? Lea kind of was one of those people who just came about while we were out there interviewing other people. And then, people would say, well, what's your film about? And we would talk about, we're going to explore Mothman in depth. The fact that it could have been a mutated bird, could have been a pterodactyl. We had discussed with some anthropologists about the idea that like extinct species that still remain. We talked about the coelacanth fish, which is a fish that was thought to be extinct for many years, and then all of a sudden it resurfaces. So we kind of use that as a jumping off point of like, well, could there have been a species of bird, a dodo bird, a pterodactyl, something ridiculous, but is it possible that it still existed? And then funny enough, while we're out there, we're talking about these things kind of casually, and someone goes, well, I know somebody who swears to God they saw a goddamn pterodactyl. It was really just about her personal story. It was a short one-off thing, but it fit beautifully into our film because it's someone who, again, you hear these stories and they sound ridiculous, but here you have this, adult woman who very surely says that as a young person living on a farm, she heard a very crazy noise outside her window, and she goes outside to like observe this bird that she cannot identify as being anything regional that she's familiar with. And I do remember her saying, I grew up out here. People out here know animals. We don't get confused. We know what vultures look like. We know what cranes look like. And so it's kind of like the Merle Partridge thing. When someone from the Air Force looks at a series of lights on a flying object and can't identify it, it just adds a little bit to the credibility of their story in that they have a foundation of expertise.
I remember her telling the story, and she was also she was fairly young when we interviewed her. I think she might have been in her 20s, late 20s, early 30s possibly. And so it's not like she was recollecting a story that happened like 30, 40 years ago. She was talking about something that was, from like maybe 15 years earlier. So that right away made me think, it's not like it's so far in the past that it's unbelievable, like she can't remember correctly. So I remember thinking, yeah, this is something like plausible. And when she was talking about it, it was kind of like, like, it's not that I didn't believe her, because she didn't say, yeah, this is what I saw and this is definitely it. She just said this, this is what it looked like. And that made me believe her because she wasn't saying like, this is a definite thing. I don't know. She was just giving details that made me think, this is definitely a possibility. Yeah,
it was the only thing that she can compare it to. And like, look, there could have been a rational explanation for it, but the whole idea of it is that people can see things and not know what they are. It doesn't mean that their account is not true, but the idea that it's just something unusual or fantastical, that these things do happen. I mean, I can compare it. You can't because you have no experiences and it's not fair. I hate telling stories like this in front of you because you just give me the look of like, I'm crazy. But I will say there is like a story that I had in my own personal life that I can compare to something like this. Now, I once saw something that I can't explain what it was. And the only comparative thing that I can relate it to is something absurd. So there was one time I was driving at night and there was a creature. Again, just my natural way of it was a creature. It wasn't an animal. It was something in the road walking away from me. My headlights hit it. It wasn't going fast. It was going slow. It was trotting like a horse trots. It was the size of like maybe a Great Dane. It was big. I saw the pads of its feet, pads like a dog would have, but it was big and tall and muscular. And it turned around and like looked at me. And it was a unusual thing that happened. And the only thing I can compare it to is a goddamn werewolf, because it didn't look like a wolf. It didn't look like a dog. It didn't look like a coyote. It didn't look like something with mange. The only thing in my vocabulary, in my life that I can compare it to is a goddamn werewolf. Now, so like, you know how hard it is to tell somebody this story and be like, I saw a fucking werewolf? But it's the only way I can describe what I saw. And so there's a relatableness to it.
You make fun of me like I'm a big skeptic. No, I have those types of stories. You know, I have things that I can't explain that seem supernatural to me that I'm to this day, I remember them so vividly because they shocked me so much. I mean, I'll tell you, I was in Ireland and on the West Coast, and it was a place where writers would go throughout history. W.B. Yeats and E.E. Cummings and all that would go to this area of nature, and it was trees, and you know, it's Ireland. It's very old and it's very mystical and all that. And I'm walking through a time of the year where there are lots of leaves down, a lot of crunching leaves underneath my feet, and the trees were naked. They had nothing on them. And crunch, 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 birds, all this type of stuff. And then there's this rock wall. And some of the rocks were missing. And I climbed over this short rock wall. And as soon as I stepped foot in there were evergreen trees. So there were no dead crunching leaves. And it was maybe 2 feet of nothing but pine needles that you're walking on the ground. So it's spongy and quiet. And there's no birds. As soon as I crossed over that rock wall, it went away. It was just dead quiet. And I looked across this small forest, and there was a rock wall on the other side with a bunch of rocks in a certain pattern that had fallen off. And I walked straight across this thing, almost like my feet weren't touching the ground. And it was a mystical, weird feeling. I was there with a class in college, and I was by myself. And I crossed across this whole thing, and I got to those rocks, and I turned around, and it was the exact same image when I turned around as when I first went over the rock wall. I'm looking back at the rock wall that I came from, and the rocks had fallen. It wasn't like a pattern that someone had intentionally done. It was identical. It was an exact image from where I just came from. And I walked back to where I came from, and I turned around again, the exact same image. It was exactly the same. Like it was almost like a mirrored kind of world. And then I stepped over that thing and tweet, 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 crunch, crunch, crunch. All this noise was, again, you hear the wind and everything. And it was like really mystical. It was really strange. But then I heard people calling my name because the bus was ready to go. And they're like, "Where have you been? We've been looking for you for like 2 hours."
What?
And I was missing for 2 hours, but you were right there?
Not to me. To me, I was gone for 15 minutes looking around at just the place because I wanted to tool around by myself. And they were like, everyone was on the bus waiting for Neil Stevens to return because we were driving back to Dublin. And I'm like, I wasn't gone that long. I was only gone a few minutes. They're like, we were calling your name for forever. And I was sitting on that bus going, it's getting weirder.
Yeah, that's weird.
Did you explain to them what happened?
Yeah. And they're like, well, we were looking all over for you and we couldn't find you. And no one had seen the part where I was. No one had talked about the evergreens and the rock wall and all this.
That's so strange.
And no one was around. Like I saw not a soul.
Meanwhile, like you entered another realm.
Yeah. And it was really like to this day, I still can't explain it, but it was like you heard your breath. It was so quiet. You heard your own heart beating in this place.
You went through a portal.
I don't know what it was, but like you say, like you're making fun of me. No. I mean, I understand. It's inexplicable, but it's I do have those. I think everyone has those moments where you can say, I don't know how to explain this, but I know I saw it and I remember it as clear as it's happening in front of me right now.
Absolutely. It's like the reporter that we interviewed and discussed on an earlier episode, Dave Payton. He said, most of the people when they would call to report their incident would say, I know this sounds crazy, or I know I'm going to sound like a weirdo and I'm not on drugs. Like you have to preface it with those things because you know how ridiculous it sounds. So like when you look at Lee's story, it's not easy. It's not easy, especially to sit in front of strangers to tell that you saw what you think could have been a pterodactyl. So you have to at least value their openness to talk about it. And then again, like when you hear the words coming out of their mouth, when you hear the inflection, the recounting, and the detail, you can start to go, not necessarily like, do I believe them or not, but do I believe that they believe themselves? I'm glad things like that are in the film because it's easy to do voiceover and talk about, oh, I remember in our movie, we're trying to compare other stories of Mothman that have existed. There's the Jersey Devil. There's, a story of people who were exploring a cave and they come across a pterodactyl. And so alone, they just become a tall tale. But as soon as you reinforce it with a modern day woman who goes, no, I saw something similar, it just helps build and build and build and create a connectivity amongst all of these things where as like a filmmaker, all I'm asking you to do is go, don't just throw it away. Just give it a little bit of respect that something probably happened and then it's not, as easy to go, oh, it's just a hallucination or it's just someone who's seeing something that they're misrepresenting. Like just give it a little bit of respect that these people are willing to talk about it and it's not rewarding. It's not easy. They're not getting paid. They're not getting compensated. They don't really get anything out of it. Anything, they get ridicule.
Yeah. Well, I think also you have to consider, yes, she came up and she had her story and all these people have their stories. How many people out there had something like that happen to them? And like you say, you have to preface, you're going to sound crazy. You're going to think I'm drunk. You think I'm on drugs or all that kind of stuff. How many people have a fear that someone's going to look at them weird, that they're going to look at them funny or that they're crazy or whatever? So they never tell the story. So they never bring it up. So how many people hear stories like this and go in their minds, yeah, I had something similar, and they just never reveal it because they don't want to be considered like these people who get ridiculed.
It's a short and sweet interview, but I'm glad we were able to capture it and include it in our documentary. So here's a look back at Lea Wilson in her raw interview tape discussing her pterosaur encounter.
Camera speed. Okay, so you're going to be focusing on the same stuff applies. Just talk to me and try to reiterate the question here. So I only have a few questions.
Okay.
So I'm covering a lot of Mothman sightings and things like that and stuff. So you actually had kind of something similar where you saw something, heard something kind of out of the ordinary. Can you just tell me first, tell me your name and spell it.
It's Lea Wilson. It's Lea and then Wilson, Wilson. And I'm from here in Parkersburg, West Virginia.
Okay, great. So can you tell me what happened? What did you see? Just describe the event for me. As many details as you can. Just let me know.
Okay. What had happened, it was the summer of 1988. I was in Calhoun County, West Virginia, visiting my family on their land. It was approximately 2:00 in the morning. I'm a late night owl person, so I stay up all hours. And I just went and laid down. The bedroom that I stayed in when I visited was on the ground floor on the front of the house. Across the street is their garage barn, and I guess in West Virginia you call it the holler, that goes up for about a mile. And I laid down and I start hearing this sound, and how I describe it is a pterodactyl type sound, how Hollywood describes dinosaur type movies and so forth. And it's from a distance, and it just keeps getting louder and louder and louder. And finally, by the time it got to me, it frightened me because it got so loud because it sounded like it was right in front of me. By the time I had sat up in my bed, and the bedroom I stayed in had a bay window type thing. So it was wide, it covered most of the front porch. When I had sat up, this creature just with the wingspan that covered the whole window. I mean, I couldn't see the moonlight, the outside lights of anything. Just kind of went up in front of the house, and it made a sound straight up over the house. And my heart's pounding. Didn't scream. I think I actually stopped breathing for a minute because I never, I grew up on this farm, on this land. I've never seen or heard anything like it before. And when I turned around, because there's a window behind me, I seen it flying out over the pasture field to the back barn, to the woods. And, about that time, my uncle heard it. He never seen it, but he heard it. It's stumbling down the steps and what is that? The whole family's, awake at that time in the house. And it was just I never seen the shoulders down is all I seen. I didn't see anything from the shoulders up, but the wingspan was just humongous, and it had a body-like figure in the center of the wingspan.
So if you had to kind of describe the physical way it looked, if you were kind of giving like a character description to the police, say, or something like that, as an example, how would you describe it? Tell them.
Just huge. It was dark. It was just, I don't know if it's because it was so close to me on the porch, when I finally sat up in bed to see it. I couldn't see any texture, like if it was furry or feathery or anything like that. All I could see was just a silhouette of the wingspan, and you could tell that there was a center part between, in between the wings. But that, there is no face to it. There is no red glowing eyes. I couldn't see anything like that. It was just the sound and the silhouette of the shape and size of whatever this was.
Can you tell me describe the sound? You said it sounded almost kind of like reptilian, or maybe like just like how you describe how you had heard in the film before, like what a pterodactyl type thing sounded. Tell me about that.
I mean, that's exactly, the sound was just like a pterodactyl, like what the Hollywood portray that type of prehistoric creature would be. And like I said, being in the country and growing up in the country, being on this land my whole life, I've never heard any sound, high screeching sound is what I heard that night. That's what scared me the most until I sat up and seen this figure was the sound. Because I've heard owls, I've heard vultures, and this sound, I've never heard anything like it since either.
You had mentioned that the thing that you saw kind of sounded like a pterodactyl, and there were actually like a lot of sightings of the Mothman. A lot of people said that it looked like a pterodactyl. Like a lot of people compared it, some people, those that didn't describe it with the red eye, like that, there were a lot of cases that described it as like prehistoric looking. And, and then tell me about what you heard and how that kind of
how I came about fitting the two together.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that was actually in high school. I was actually a year later, if you want to hear that. Okay. Like I said, I was in the summer of 1988. The next summer, I was my freshman year in high school, and I had to do a social studies project. And at this time, I'm only 15, 16 years old. I'd never heard of the Mothman before. It was way before my time. And I'm doing research for a social studies project. And I come across the story of the bridge in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the Silver Bridge, and how it fell down, so forth, and the history of the Mothman and the story, and the drawings and the sketches of the eyewitnesses at that time, and all these books. When I'm reading this book and reading these stories and seeing those drawings, in the back of my head, I'm going, that's exactly what I saw, but except for the shoulders down. Everybody, I've spoke to a lot of people that, had that Mothman encounters and live in Point Pleasant. No one, they always use the red eyes and the wingspan and the shape and stuff as a description. I always use the sound. Nobody has ever used a description as a sound of what they seen or heard or experienced. So when I seen that description and the drawings and the sketches in the book, that took me right back to the summer before, and it just took my heart racing. I'm like, well, maybe I did experience this. Maybe it is still in West Virginia. So that's how I connected the two together, of being the Mothman and what I saw.
I'm just asking one more question.
Okay.
And, what I'm going to try to do is deliver this part of information that there were, what I'm doing is covering the different perspectives of different people who reported the Mothman as, some people thought it was a bird, some people thought it was a monster, some people thought it was a creature. So I'd like to try to use your sighting and sound of it to kind of tell a little bit about the prehistoric sightings of it. Okay. Even though it's not, how you would describe it visually, but it's how you describe it like in audio. So can you just tell me something along the lines of, maybe the best way I can describe what I heard, something, prehistoric in terms of like the same thing you told me. Tell me that again in terms of the way Hollywood has kind of portrayed the pterodactyl type thing is sounding. So tell me the same thing there, but in the end, can you also just add something like, what's interesting is there were people who witnessed the Mothman that actually described it as looking prehistoric. That way I kind of brought the two together of the way it sounds with your case with the
Okay.
way it looks with other people's. That's
Okay.
what I'm trying to do.
Okay. Okay. When this occurred, the sound, the pterodactyl sound, just like I said, it took my heart racing. That's what scared me the most. Growing up in the country, I hear all creature sounds. You know, nothing's ever frightened me like this had. I'd never heard anything like that since. And during the research in school, it was kind of interesting that the eyewitnesses did describe it as a prehistoric creature. You know, the shape and the outline of it and the sketches that I seen, and that's, you know, that's what I saw. But I also heard it. You know, I also had the audio effect along with the sight of the Mothman. Is that what you wanted?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Okay.
One more question, just kind of to reiterate the first story. Can you just tell me, the same thing you had told me where, just tell me one more time what you saw, and also tell me about the sound and how, you familiarized it with, on television.
The Hollywood
kind of
okay.
Hollywood kind of prehistoric sound of, that, and that's how you kind of make, that's what you acquainted, what you heard.
Okay.
Just
Do the wingspan thing and all that too.
Tell me about the way it looked, and then I'll tell me about, but more so for what stood out for you was the sound. And
Okay.
just, the way it sounded, kind of, I guess, prehistoric in what Hollywood had, always portrayed on television.
Okay. When this happened, I sat up in bed, the sound, like I said, just raced through me. When at the morning after, when everything happened and I was calmed down, the only way I was able to describe it to my family, and again, they heard it also, was how the Hollywood would portray a prehistoric animal and pterodactyl type sound. That was the only way I was able to describe it to my family and friends. And the family that wasn't there, the friends that wasn't there, it was very hard for them to believe that such a sound came out of the woods of Calhoun County. But, the family that was there that did hear it, they know it's true. They heard it. They just didn't have the visual effect that I did to go along with it.
Okay, that's perfect.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Eyes of the Mothman, the podcast. For more information about our program, or to find out where you can watch the original documentary film or purchase a limited edition signed DVD copy, please visit www.eyesofthemothman.com.